Greetings from the National Archives flagship building in Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank peoples. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual author lecture with Bob Drury and Tom Clavin, co-authors of Blood and Treasure. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs you can view on our YouTube channel. On Thursday, May 13th at noon, historian Jonathan Zimmerman and Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Signa Wilkinson will present their new book, Free Speech. This brief but bracing book tells the story of free speech in America and makes the case for why we should care about it today. And on Tuesday, May 18th at 7 p.m., we will host a panel discussion titled Celebrating the Women's Suffrage Centennial. Our panelists will discuss the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020, the events that were planned across the country, and what we learned during that turbulent year. In Blood and Treasure, Bob Drury and Tom Clavin describe the inevitable conflict along the trans-Appalachian frontier between westward-moving European colonists and the Native Americans who already lived there. Using the story of Daniel Boone in the decades leading up to and through the Revolutionary War, Drury and Clavin paint a vivid picture of a bloody struggle that changed the course of the newly emerging nation. In a recent book review in the Wall Street Journal, Peter Cozzens called Blood and Treasure the author's finest work to date, and said Drury and Clavin excel not only in superb portrayals of Boone and his white frontier contemporaries, but also in the evocation of the Eastern Woodland Indians, their way of life, their heart-wrenching efforts to protect their land from white encroachment. Bob Drury, a New York Times best-selling author and military correspondent, is the author, co-author, or editor of 9 books. He has reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, Liberia, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and Darfur, and has written for numerous publications including the New York Times, Vanity Fair, Men's Journal, and GQ. Bob has been nominated for 3 National Magazine Awards and a Pulitzer Prize. Tom Clavin was a reporter for the New York Times, served as managing editor at the East Hampton Star, and was the editor-in-chief of the independent group of weekly newspapers, and was a columnist and contributing writer at the Express News Group on Long Island. He has written for several prominent magazines, including Smithsonian, Parade, Reader's Digest, and Golf. He has received awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, and the National Newspaper Association. Tom and Bob have co-authored several books, and 4 of them, Dodge City, The Heart of Everything That Is, Halsey's Typhoon, and The Last Stand of Fox Company, have been New York Times bestsellers. Now let's hear from Bob Drury and Tom Clavin. Thank you for joining us today.
Mr. Ferriero, thank you for that lovely introduction. It was wonderful, David, and I'm so heartened that you got the pronunciation of Appalachian correct. I can't tell you how many times it's not Appalachian, it's Appalachian. I'd also, before we even begin, I have to thank Doug Swanson for setting this all up at the National Archives, and for the 2 men that make this happen, Brian and Jason in the sound and video booth. We wouldn't be here without you. So thank you all. Thank you all, whoever is out there in YouTube land, for tuning in. I guess that's how you do. Am I too old, Tom? Do I get tuning in right? Would you tune into YouTube?
Works for me.
So, I don't know. How about if I start with dispelling a few myths about the man who, his name is in our subtitle, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier. First of all, Daniel Boone did not die at the Alamo. That was Davy Crockett. You would not believe how many people confuse the two. So Boone met his end in San Antonio, Texas in 1836. No. Boone lived to the ripe old age of nearly 86, and he died in Missouri. And the second is, and this is another one that is almost universally believed, Daniel Boone did not wear and hated coonskin caps. That, again, was Davy Crockett. Boone was of average height for a man of his era, 5'7", 5'8", but his cousins on his mother's Welsh side were big men, giants almost for the era, for the time. 6'3", 6'2", And Boone always considered himself short. He had a complex, and he thought that a coonskin cap would make him look even shorter. So he liked a nice tall hunter's cap. All right, with that out of the way, we can blame Walt Disney, I suppose, who cast the actor Fess Parker as both Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett in the Disney television shows of the 50s and 60s. So it's a funny thing. When Tom and I first came up with the germ of an idea for this book, Daniel Boone was so far, he wasn't even on our radar. I was going to say so far off our radar, but he was not even on our radar. What we wanted to do, and what we hope we have done, is written a biography of an era, not of an individual, an era when the stirrings of the Atlantic-bound 13 colonies were suddenly looking west, when the concept of manifest destiny was in the air, and although the phrase manifest destiny was not to be coined for another half century, another 50 years, but we wanted to write about this volatile era, and of course we thought that we needed a guide, someone who was going to take us through this era. And what had worked so well in one of our previous books, which David mentioned, The Heart of Everything That Is, Red Cloud was the perfect guide for that era a century later. So naturally, we thought an American Indian might do the trick. We looked at Pontiac, the Ottawa Pontiac's rebellion. I'm sure you've heard of it. His flame burned bright, but it was doused way too soon for our purposes. Tecumseh came a little bit later than the time frame we wanted to write about. There's some of the lesser indigenous headmen, Little Turtle, Blackfish. You've probably never heard of these. Cornstalk. They were protagonists, wonderful protagonists, and they're in our book in and of their own right, but they could not carry, they didn't live long enough to carry the entire narrative. We even looked at Frenchmen and Brits. I mean, they were the two European countries were such a overwhelming presence on the North American continent, from Canada to west to Fort Detroit, across what they call the Old Northwest, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, south to Kentucky, and the 13 colonies in itself. But there was not a Frenchman or an Englishman who lent itself. Yet, as we got deeper and deeper into our research, one name just kept appearing: Boone. Whether it was George Boone, Daniel's grandfather, whether it was Squire Boone, Daniel's father, and of course Boone. Boone seemed to be everywhere. He was the Zelig of the era we wanted to write about, or for you younger viewers out there, I guess the Forrest Gump of the era. And I remember Tom thinking, well, Boone's been done. And I remember you telling me, we're not doing a biography of Daniel Boone. We're going to use Daniel Boone as the guide to take us through this time frame. And I thought that was such a smart idea. And I worried that Boone was overdone. But once again, Tom, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you say there's always more stuff besides what you read in high school or what Walt Disney put on the screen. Do you agree?
I think that's very true of Daniel Boone. First of all, even though there have been some books about Daniel Boone, I mean, David Mack Farragher is one example of a very good book by Daniel Boone. We didn't think anything had been done recently. And also, again, we were not writing a biography of Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was he was our guide. He was our pathfinder through the story, as he was through the Cumberland Gap, as he was through the Appalachian Mountains, as he was through Kentucky, as he was through Missouri. And so there's that aspect of it. And I think to me, a big part about the book that connects to Boone, but connects to many of the other characters and connects to the heart of our story is, well, what's the connection between Daniel Boone and Van Morrison? Okay, I have one for you. Years and years and years ago, Van Morrison did an album, one of his more successful ones, titled A Sense of Wonder. And as I was, we were working on this book, and just in the last few days when I was rereading some portions of it to prepare for this program. I think what the book conveys is the sense of wonder that Daniel Boone had, and that other people have. John Finley, some of the other Simon Kenton, some of the other people who were the first ones to cross over the mountains, cross through the mountains, and they would come to the Ohio Valley. They would come to what would later become Kentucky and Missouri, and they were seeing land, woodlands, and hills, and valleys, and streams, and rivers, and game that certainly no white man had seen before. This was the home of Indian tribes, so I'm not going to use the word they discovered this territory. They did not discover it by any means, but it was a great sense of wonder that they had to see these things and to marvel at them. And I think that's something that is a theme in the book, that as the years go on and we extend our story, not just Daniel Boone, but what's happening on that western side of the Appalachian Mountains, and with the Cherokee, with the Shawnee, with the Kickapoo, and some of the other Delaware, and some of the other tribes, there's a mutual sense of wonder in that the white settlers and explorers and hunters are seeing things for the first time, including these tribes and this culture. And the Indians, the indigenous people, for the first time are seeing the white folks. They're coming through the gap into over the mountains, and to some extent their culture, because they have the difference with the white people, the settlers. They're looking for land ownership. The Indians didn't have that same concept of land ownership. They were thinking more about survival because of what the land represented as far as hunting, and what they did with the natural resources, which made sure the tribe could live another day. So it eventually became a clash, but I think initially it was these two peoples who were connecting, encountering each other for the first time, and filled with wonder about where do they come from, what do they want, what do they do, what's their belief system, all these things. I hope that we conveyed that in the book, because I think it's a very important part of the story. And as that is sort of like kind of an umbrella, I think, and Bob could speak to this, we have so many, to me, another big part of the story is so many interesting characters, whatever their background, white or red, explorer, hunters, headmen, tribal authority, medicine men. There's so many interesting and colorful characters that, we could have easily, I think the book clocks in at about 400 pages. It could easily have been a 600-page book.
Yeah, but then we would have had no readers, unfortunately. But I take your point about the historian Francis Jennings, who was one of my favorite historians. I'll make sure I get this quote right. Europeans did not conquer wilderness, to what Tom said about just because in 1850, or actually probably earlier, some French explorers discovered, quote marks, the Cumberland Gap. Well, the indigenous people had been using the Cumberland Gap for millennia. The Cherokee to run north, they called it the Warrior's Path. That was part of the Warrior's Path. When the Cherokees ran north to raid Shawnee villages, and when the Shawnees and the Delaware ran south to raid Cherokee and Choctaw and Chickasaw villages, they all used the Cumberland Gap. But Francis Jennings, Europeans did not conquer wilderness. They conquered Indians. They did not discover America. They invaded it. And to Tom's point about Boone being central to this narrative, I briefly mentioned Boone's grandfather, George Boone. When William Penn was trying to treat somewhat fairly with the mostly Delaware and sometimes Shawnee Indians, it was every other colony, by the way, had a militia to fight Indians. William Penn never stood up with militia. It was George Boone, Daniel Boone's grandfather, who stood next to him. He was also a Quaker. When the first stirrings of Westering started to ripple through the Euro-American communities on the Atlantic seaboard, it was Squire Boone, Daniel's father, who led a wagon train down through the Shenandoah Valley, which was just being populated, and into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. And by the way, the 16-year-old Daniel at the time was already a pathfinder, a forester, a crack shot, and the best hunter. And so he was in charge of procuring game for the wagon train. And then, of course, Boone himself. I mean, you can't write about the era without writing about the French and Indian War, which secured the North American continent for the Brits. And you can't write about the French and Indian War without writing about General Edward Braddock's excursion into the deepest heart of Pennsylvania to drive the French from Fort Duquesne, which was later renamed Fort Pitt, when of course became Pittsburgh. And Braddock's expedition was, Braddock's Folly, they called it, because his army was wiped out. And who was on that expedition? Daniel Boone was a 20-year-old teamster. He was nearly killed next to the 23-year-old militia colonel, George Washington. Can you imagine what the history of this country would be with that if Daniel Boone and George Washington had both been killed on that expedition? And then there was Boone through the Cumberland Gap. Now, of course, he did not discover it. He wasn't even the first white man through it, but he was the one that led the party that axed their way through it and widened it for pack horses, not for Conestoga wagons. It was another 30 years before wagons could get through. But he widened it and he settled Kentucky, which leads to, I think, Tom, probably what is surprise too strong a word when I bring up the role that Boone played in the American Revolution on the Western Front. It surprised the hell out of me, I can tell you that.
It certainly surprised me too, because I did not know. I mean, a couple of things. One, we certainly had to refresh our memories when we first started incorporating Daniel Boone into this book. When did he live? What was his heyday, for example? But what was the span of his life? Was he alive before, after the American Revolution? There is the confusion with Davy Crockett, who came after the American Revolution. And then I think so he was part of the American Revolution, but I think also what surprised us is how active the Western Front was. The Western frontier during the American Revolution is, I think, to most people, a non-starter. Everything all was quiet on the Western Front during the American Revolution, because everything was happening in Virginia and Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The most famous battles, and of course, the subject of our previous book, Valley Forge, took place in Pennsylvania. And so to discover that you had, during the French and Indian War, which was lost by the French, and they were pretty much kicked out of North America, and the British took over, their relationship with the Indians became more prominent. And so when the American Revolution took place, you had British leaders like Sir Henry Hamilton, who was the lieutenant governor, and he was headquartered in Detroit.
The hair buyer.
The hair buyer was his nickname because he basically offered a bounty to the Indians who were allies of the British, that if you get paid if you bring scalps. But Henry Hamilton and the British were basically saying to the Indians, fight with us, fight on our behalf, fight in company with us, and as a result, you'll get your land back. With these white people, these white Americans who have been taking away your land, let's defeat them, let's kick them out, and it could be yours once again. Now, by this point in the 1770s, this probably, first of all, was never going to happen anyway. And then, as it turned out, when the American Revolution ended and the treaty was signed ending the American Revolution, there was no mention of any protection for the Indians or any consideration or any compensation or anything from the British for having enlisted them as allies. So on the Western frontier, you had these British-led Indian armies that were attacking the forts. And we mentioned in the book at one point, there were as many as 10 forts. They were called stations then, mostly at the time, 10 stations in Kentucky. And it wasn't too long before it was whittled down to 3, because the others had either fallen or been abandoned, been conquered. And so that Daniel Boone was the most famous of the frontiersmen who were leading the American cause, so to speak, which really on the Western frontier, the American cause was survival. If the forts had fallen, we believe it would have opened up the door to George Washington being attacked from behind, having to fight a two-front war. But the other, I think, less political, more practical consequence for people like Daniel Boone in his fort called Boonesboro, and his comrades and the families and their families, is that there would have been no place left for them to go. There was no safe place for them. They would have died. They would have been taken hostage if they were lucky, but most of them would have been killed, and in a very horrible way. So that Daniel Boone played a prominent role in the American Revolution by really leading the frontier fight against the British and the British-led Indian tribes I remember feeling how lucky we were to be able to not only discover this, but to include this in our book, because we really believed, and I think it's true from the feedback we've gotten, almost no one knows about Daniel Boone and the American Revolution.
Turning back that Hamilton's Anglo-Canadian Indian Army at Boonesboro, vastly outnumbered at Boonesboro, a week-long siege, and Hamilton's army scattered back across the Ohio River, saving, as Tom mentioned, saving General Washington's Continental Army for having to fight a two-front war, which Washington was not sure he could win a two-front war. And so that role that Boone played on the western frontier of the American Revolution did come as a surprise to me. What might come as also a surprise, maybe perhaps not a good one for people with delicate stomachs, is that one reviewer, it wasn't Peter Cousins, who David Ferriero mentioned in his opening. I can't remember who it was, but he gave us a terrific review, but then as kind of like a movie rating at the bottom, he said, "Blood and Treasure is not for the faint of heart." And I cannot disagree with him. I mean, that's the blood in Blood and Treasure. The treasure was the land. The blood was, let's face it, the book opens with Daniel Boone's 16-year-old eldest son, James, having just been ambushed. His party was just ambushed by a combined Cherokee, Delaware, Shawnee war party. James is bleeding out in the shadow of Cumberland Mountain, gut shot. And the Indian who led the ambush, was known as Big Jim to the Anglos and the Americans, is standing over James Boone, plucking his fingernails out, plucking his toenails out before he scalps him and bashes in his head. And the book, years and years later, ends with Daniel Boone's, another son of Daniel Boone, Israel Boone, dying in his father's arms, an Indian's musket ball lodged in his heart, and gouts of blood are spewing out of his mouth as he tries to tell his father goodbye. And in between, there is a lot of what historian called a whirlwind of blood and carnage in our book. But that's just the way it was. The American people, or I should say the Euro-American people, from Cotton Mather, preaching from his pulpit, the famous preacher Cotton Mather, preaching from his pulpit in Boston about the devilish red sons of Satan, to even such luminaries as Thomas Jefferson, who once proposed exterminating the tribes between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. The Indians knew the Americans, or the Anglo-Americans, and then the Americans wanted their land, and they were not about to give it up without a fight. So there was a grand tour of hideous torture and disembowelment and dismemberment and scalpings and burning at the stakes. And but I do want to emphasize, before I throw it back to Tom, the butcher's bill for this era, the mid to late 18th century, it went both ways. For every white infant scalped or tied to a tree to use as target practice for arrows, or for every militiaman who was made to dance while his arms were lopped off, or for every Continental Army officer who was burned at the stake. There was a lot of burning at the stakes, to the point where one witness remembers one colonel, a friend of George Washington's, as a matter of fact. He had been flayed, he had been burned, and as he was being burned, his brains boiled so that they melted and whistled out of his a whistling came out of his nostrils, reminiscent of a tea kettle. But for every Native American atrocity, there was also a Euro-American atrocity that we had. There were militiamen who would fall on peaceful villages and just kill men, women, and children. There was that Pennsylvania delegation that fell on a converted Delaware village. They had converted to the Moravian faith. They would not take up arms. And as they lined up to have their heads smashed in, men, women, and children, once again, they sang hymns and said prayers. There were what began on one of the many Indian wars, Lord Dunmore's War. What began this was when these Virginia militiamen lured a small troop of Mingos into a trading post, ostensibly to talk peace with them, and then murdered them all, including the wife of the Mingo leader, Logan. And once again, Tom mentioned that Henry Hamilton up in Detroit was paying for scalps. Well, the lead military officer in the North American continent, Jeffrey Amherst, was also paying for scalps. And, well, if you could get a scalp, doesn't matter where you could get it from. You could dig up an Indian graveyard in the middle of an attack on a village, or you could cut open the wombs of pregnant Indian women, rip out the fetuses, and scalp them. It sounds to us, I mean, David mentioned in his opening, I have spent some time in hellholes from Darfur to Afghanistan to Iraq to Sarajevo, Belfast. At least you could get a beer at the end of the day in Belfast. You couldn't anywhere else. But I think if I were surprised, I guess, Tom, by the role Daniel Boone played in the Western Front of the American Revolution, I was also fairly surprised by the carnage, the utter carnage that permeated this period. I don't know if you were or not, but it took me aback.
I think we had prepared ourselves a little bit for this. You know, it was sort of I hearken back to when we were working on our book, The Heart of Everything That Is, which came out in 2013. And Bob had mentioned it earlier. Red Cloud is our main character, and it basically is the last 10 to 15 years of the Plains Indians before they were forced onto reservations, and Red Cloud's war in the mid-1860s. And certainly it was present in that book. So I maybe was a bit surprised that there had been no evolution of violence. It had been bad a century earlier, more than a century earlier. It had been bad then. It just continued as the tribes retreated west, and as the white settlers and explorers and hunters intruded further west. But something that I think is very important to point out is that connected to this is that Daniel Boone, many if not almost all of his contemporaries believed that they could commit these atrocities. First of all, because in some cases they thought they were getting revenge for what was visited upon them, but also because they didn't look at the Indians as humans.
Heathens,
the heathens,
savages.
They were subhumans, and so you were skinning an animal, for example. You weren't skinning a human being. However, what's very important that I think we should point out is that Daniel Boone was not. He was a man of his time, yes, but he was a man out of his time as far as his attitude towards Indians, which was good because I think it would have been very difficult for us, maybe impractical for us to spend, all these pages with Daniel Boone. And he's an insufferable person as far as his relationship with Native Americans. Quite the opposite. He, first of all, as a child, his family always lived on the edge of the frontier. So he was interacting with Native Americans as a child, as an adolescent, as a teenager. He came to admire them. He was fascinated with the way they walk, the way they carry themselves, their language, their jewelry, their clothing, their survival skills. He learned a lot from them that he adapted into his own everyday activity when he was hungry. Their medicine, that they could cure ailments and wounds, things like that. So even their religion. I mean, he is somebody that came from a Quaker family, and he said at one point that he had as much respect for the Great Spirit as he did for any Christian God. And that's because he was somebody who admired people who were proud people who knew how to survive, who took care of families. I think one of the interesting things that some of the characters find out is the idea that Indians love their families and how they treated their families, and that's not something that subhumans do. Or why would they care about their families? How do you love if you're subhuman or a savage? And so I I think we got it right, and we certainly made a great effort that somebody reading Blood and Treasure is going to get a really in-depth portrait from the indigenous point of view. Daniel Boone's in the subtitle, but so much of what we write about and so many of the anecdotes and so much of the information is from the indigenous point of view. So you know some of these characters, like a few we mentioned before, like Cornstalk and Hanging Maw and Dragging Canoe and Blackfish, and to the young Tecumseh, and so we want people to really feel like a you are there quality. They've just made a trip to the edge of the frontier in the 1760s and 1770s.
He was a different man. As I think Tom put it best, out of his time, yet in his time. Cotton Mather, who I mentioned before, probably would have excommunicated. Well, even though Cotton Mather wasn't a Quaker, there was a word with the Quakers kicked you out, Tom. I can't remember it, but disassociated. I can't remember what the word was, but the Quakers would have no truck with Daniel Boone's empathy for the Indians' great spirit. That's, as Tom mentioned, I think that's what really drew us to this man, this Pathfinder, as a guide. The fact that he wasn't repellent, he wasn't repugnant. He really tried to understand the Indians' point of view. Now, at one point he was captured and he was adopted into the Shawnee tribe. And he tried to convince them. Now, this grates on our 21st century ears, but he tried to convince them, listen, the Long Knives are going to wipe you out unless you become more white. That's a quote, an unquote, to Daniel Boone's first biographer. That sounds, what do you mean more white? That sounds so off color to us, even if not profane, perhaps. But it showed that Boone, the man of his time, his heart was in the right place, which made him a man out of his time. And what I think that Tom, when we talked early on about Tom saying, there's more to Boone than most people know. There's more to Boone than the Disneyfication of Boone or what we learn in history. And I think there are two stories that kind of illustrate that. One went down in Boone family lore as Old Daniel Surprise. Daniel would go on these long hunts. Long hunters, their heyday was only a decade and a half long. But at the time, they were as mythical as the mythical Johnny Appleseed or Paul Bunyan, and they would disappear into the forest beyond the frontier for 12, 16, maybe 2 years, and they'd come out with their pack horses laden with deer skins and beaver furs, beaver pelts, and at one point, Boone was off on another Indian war, this one called the Cherokee War. He was part of the North Carolina militia. And on the way back, after they had defeated Cherokee, he asked his commanding officer, do you mind if I hunt? He was in eastern Tennessee, and he didn't know the territory. And so he hunted. And all told, he was gone for like 16 months. Now, Daniel Boone was he was a lettered man, as one biographer described. Not a literate man, but a lettered man. He always carried a copy of Swift's Gulliver's Travels wherever he went. So anyway, he was gone for 16 months, and he could do his arithmetic. And when he got home back to the Yadkin Valley in North Carolina, his wife, Rebecca, was nursing a baby girl. So Daniel was like 9 months. I've been gone 16, and so they talked, and Rebecca said, listen, Daniel, I thought you were dead. I'm a widow on the frontier. I thought I was a widow on the frontier with two young children, and your brother Nettie, who, by the way, Nettie was taken for Daniel's twin. They look so much alike. Your younger brother Nettie gave me comfort. He gave me succor, and one thing led to another, and I'm sorry, but I thought you were dead. And so Daniel confessed to his wife that he had had dalliances with Indian maidens, as he put it. And finally, he looked at his wife and he looked at the baby girl and he said, Nettie, huh? So much the better. It's all in the family. And this was unheard of at at the time among civilized white people, so to speak. And the other story I just want to tell real quick before I kick it back to Tom, when Boone was leading that party that was hacking its way, laying the trail before, through, and after the Cumberland Gap, a young Irishman was part of the Axe Party. And there were two women in the party. One was a black slave. The other was Daniel's daughter, Susie. And Susie was, how shall we properly say it? We are talking at the National Archives. Let's just say she was a fun-loving woman. And so this young Irishman who was part of the Axe Party came up to Daniel Boone. He had fallen in love with Susie Boone. He asked for her hand in marriage. Now, as politically as a father could, Daniel tried to dissuade this young Irishman. William Hayes was his name. Trying to convince Hayes that perhaps Susie was not a one-man kind of woman, if you know what I mean. But Hayes would not be dissuaded. He married Susie Boone. And several weeks later, Hayes reappears and he talks to Daniel, pulls Daniel Boone aside, and he said, I can't kind of get Susie to quit her, this is a quote, her frolicking ways. And Daniel just looked at him and smiled and said, you know, what did I warn you about? I mean, trot father, trot mother, did you expect a pace and colt? And the fact that we can humanize Daniel Boone in that kind of sense, I think even makes him a better guide through Blood and Treasure than we probably could have expected, right, Tom?
I think so. Also that he had, you mentioned this earlier in our talk, he had such a long life. If Daniel Boone had died, which, I mean, the lifespan for an American male probably in the mid 1700s or 1770s could have been 45 years old, if not less. And he lived to be almost 86. That he had such a long life and that he covered so much territory, literally covered so much territory, but also so much time. He experienced so many things. I mean, we even have him later in the book, when we follow Boone, the rest of Boone's life, he went on his last long hunt when he is in his mid 70s, along with his one of his best friends, Simon Kenton, and a few others. And according to several sources, he made it as far west as the Yellowstone River, and before he turned and came back. And so, what I think the tightrope we walked, and I hope we did it successfully, is Daniel Boone was a legend. He was a legend in his own time. He's a larger than life figure. He's the kind of person that tall stories were, clung to. But I think we did use the word humanize him. I think we humanized him a great deal. He was a family man. He and his wife, Rebecca, were married for 56 years. They had a whole passel of kids. He loved his children. He had as his family expanded, his children, his in-law, sons-in-laws, daughters-in-law. So I think we're seeing Daniel Boone a legend, but I think we're seeing Daniel Boone, the family man, and Daniel Boone, the explorer, and Daniel Boone, the person who, in a lot of ways, represented, going back to that sense of wonder that people were having in the 1770s when they were not discovering, but they were experiencing a new land.
Yeah.
Do we have questions?
I believe the YouTube chat box, if there's questions. What kind of records did you... Oh, you can read that, Tom, can't you?
What kind of records did you use too? Which probably...
Oh, damn. Excuse... Oh, I'll be right. I spilled coffee. Tom, take that question.
Yes, I will take that question. One of the things that we were very fortunate about is that Daniel Boone lived long enough that people in his later years were interested in finding out about the real Daniel Boone. And so there were people that went to, I guess the word is, interview him. They went to talk to him. They encouraged him to reminisce about some of his adventures, which he did. And not only did he have a long life, but he had a sharp mind until his last, very, very, very last years. So he had memories that he could convey. We have to pay a special thanks to Lyman Draper. Lyman Draper came after Boone, so he never had a chance to sit down with Boone himself, but he interviewed members of Boone's family, his sons and daughters, people who knew Boone, who was still alive when Lyman Draper came along. He was going to dedicate himself, and he did dedicate himself to collecting all this information and writing the massive authoritative biography of Daniel Boone. And he claimed that he covered something like 50,000 miles on horseback all over to place to interview people and track down records and documents and letters and things like that. And it's kind of poignant because the time finally came when Draper said, "Okay, I'm ready." After years and years of doing this, he said, "I'm ready." And he sits down and starts writing his biography, and he gets to a certain point in the biography, and he stops and he can't write anymore. I mean, I guess, to use a contemporary phrase, but this massive case of writer's block. He had all this material. I mean, pages and pages and pages of material, and he just couldn't do it. And year after year went by. So, what came of that was that Draper was I believe, the chief historian or director of the Wisconsin Historical Society. So he ended up giving up after a time. He just wasn't going to do it. And he presented all his papers and his archives and everything to the Wisconsin Historical Society. So that's a great archive on Daniel Boone material, many of it contemporaneous. So that was very important for us to be able to have access to that. And it was not by far not the only thing. There's many other sources that we use, but I think
journals, diaries, newspaper accounts. But you're right. Lyman Draper was the man.
The ultimate authoritative aspect of the book, I think, is thanks to Lyman Draper.
Yeah. Tom, do you think we could have written this book without Lyman Draper?
Well, I think yes, but I don't think we'd be as proud of it as we are, because we really do. I certainly think that people can read this book and feel confident that we did. No stone was left unturned and to get the accurate information. And Lyman Draper was a big stone.
I see we have did Boone and Crockett ever meet? No, not that we know of. Not that anyone knows of. Crockett was a bit younger than Boone. I forget how generations go, but I'm not sure if you know what he was. He was the next generation after Daniel Boone. And he was also Tennessee. And if you have ever been to the Cumberland Gap, it is at the very most northeastern part of Tennessee, where Virginia, the western part, not West Virginia, the western part of Virginia, and then you go over the Gap and you're in Kentucky. I did the Gap. I followed Daniel Boone's trail from Pennsylvania to the Yadkin Valley in North Carolina and through the Gap and up into Boonesboro and what is now Daniel Boone National Forest. And so, no, Crockett was a Western Tennessee man, and Boone, if you're looking at a map, I'll use my hands. Crockett's down here, and Boone is up here. So I better pull him back. So no, that's a long-winded answer to your question. Did they ever meet?
Related to Daniel Morgan. Yes, indeed. They were cousins.
Yeah.
And Daniel Morgan is, it's just one of those funny things. Daniel Morgan was a character in our previous book, Valley Forge, because he and his men, his frontiersmen, his sharpshooters, were part of some of the military actions that George Washington and the Continental Army participated in.
They saved Washington's bacon at Brandywine Creek by holding off.
And late in the American Revolution, Daniel Morgan is credited with leading the American forces, or the bulk of the American forces, in the Battle of Cowpens, which was a very important victory in the Southern theater of the American Revolution, late in the Revolution. So to re-encounter Daniel Morgan as a cousin of Daniel Boone, and some of their adventures together in long hunts and military exploits. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think Daniel Morgan was part of the
Braddock
heat and was badly wounded but recovered.
Shot through the jaw, and he was also. When I mentioned before that Boone's cousins on his Welsh mother's side, on his maternal side, Morgan was 6'3". I mean, he was, for the era, that was a giant of a man. And he was known in the backwoods. They called them ordinaries, which were these rough and tumble taverns where everything from horse racing to cockfighting to pistol shoot and also wrestling. Not wrestling,
Yeah.
And Daniel Morgan was allegedly, there's no way to prove this, he was allegedly an undefeated wrestler in his youth as he went from ordinary to ordinary, which means went from tavern to tavern, challenging any comers to a wrestling match for drinks, of course, for that cheap corn liquor they served out there. Tom, we have to get together sometime and drink some of that cheap corn liquor.
Well, I'm not in any hurry. I don't know what that would do. I'm not young Daniel Morgan, that's for sure.
Well, listen, Tom, I don't think we have any more questions, so let me just finish up.
Okay.
You know, Tom and I are both very aware that the four most important words in any public speaker's vocabulary are "and so in conclusion." So, and so in conclusion, not long ago, a visiting lecturer, actually he was a general, this was before our relationship with China so deteriorated. He was a general in the Chinese People's Army, and he's surprised an audience of American officers at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College by just kind of happenstancely mentioning, well, of course, the longest war in recorded history was the war fought by the United States. And the American officers were like, what is this guy talking about? I mean, yes, we've been in Afghanistan. I mean, this was maybe 6 years ago, so we would have been in Afghanistan for 14 years. And, but that doesn't come close to Europe's 30 years war, much less its violent 100 years war. And in the next breath, the Chinese officer mentioned he was talking about the United States as the Euro-American 300-year war against the North American continent's indigenous people. And the officers in attendance were some were astounded, some were dumbfounded, none really took it well, including a historian who taught at West Point at the time, Peter Maslovsky, and I like Peter Maslovsky's writing. Later, Maslovsky came around to agree with the Chinese general's statement. And he said, yes, in fact, we did fight a 300-year war against the Native Americans for their land. And if you want to see how this maybe came out, all you have to do is today in 2021, of the 330 million odd Americans, 46 million of them can trace their lineage, their ancestorship, to Americans who passed through the Cumberland Gap, which Daniel Boone opened up. And if you want to come really full circle to that whole thing, then we'll go back to what I said in the beginning, how our book opens with James Boone bleeding out and being tortured by the war party led by the intertribal war party led by the Shawnee Indian Big Jim. Later in Boone's life, he's in his mid-50s, he takes part in one more Indian war. They cross the Ohio River, the North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia militia, and they descend on this Indian town, Shawnee town, and as they're charging, Boone hears dogs baying off in the distance to his left. He knows what that means. There's probably Indian warriors over there. So he takes a platoon left. He turns left and they start chasing. They come to a meadow where he sees, in fact, a party of Indian warriors fleeing. As they're pounding after them on their horses, one Indian stops, kneels, shoulders his Kentucky long rifle, and blows out of the saddle the militiaman next to Boone. Boone pulls up, he reins up, and he looks, and it is, in fact, Big Jim, the Shawnee who had killed his son James low those years ago. Boone is stunned. Big Jim, and they recognize each other. And Big Jim is frantically trying to reload. And as he's reloading, Boone is standing there. He draws his sword. And he looks, and he looks. And what happens next I don't know, Tom. Should I tell them, or should I tell them if they want to know what happens next, they better read the damn book? What do you think?
Oh, I always vote for they've got to better read the damn book.
Actually, I vote for buy the damn book and then read.
Better.
Right. Oh, goodness. Well, this has been. I thank you all, Tom. We thank you all. You got anything to end with?
Well, I thought I would read the first 30 pages of the book. Did we promise to do that? No, we
Oh,
didn't.
yes, I forgot.
Thank goodness
Yeah,
we did
okay,
not.
yeah.
No,
Right.
but I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the National Archives. It was an honor to have a chance to give a talk there when The Heart of Everything That Is came out, and it's an honor. The only taint on it, of course, is we're not there in person, and we hope to have an opportunity again. But at least we have this avenue to talk to people, and we're really grateful for it.
And I'm sorry for spilling my coffee. I feel all wet here, but I'm sorry for ducking out on you, but I got back as fast as I could. So that's it, people. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.